Program for International Student Assessment PISA. Assessment for Learning. Welcome in this session. In this video, we are going to discuss what is assessment, types of assessment, that is assessment for learning, which is also called formative assessment, and assessment of learning, which is also called summative assessment, and difference between assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Assessment is an integral part of teaching learning process. Then what actually assessment is? The classification of someone or something with respect to its worth. The action of assessing someone or something. The assessment of educational needs. Synonyms are evaluation, judgment, gauging, rating, estimation, appraisal, opinion, analysis, valuation, calculation, and computation. The word assessment came into use in an educational context after the Second World War. Educational assessment or educational evaluation is the systematic process of documenting and using empirical data on the knowledge, skill, attitudes, and beliefs to refine programs and improve student learning. Assessment is the only way to know whether what has been taught has been learned. Assessment is the bridge between learning and teaching, as assessment involves identifying the strengths and weaknesses of a learner. Assessment is often used interchangeably with tests, but not limited to tests. Assessment can focus on the individual learner or group of learners, and assessment is done for selection. In education, the term assessment refers to the wide variety of methods or tools that educators use to evaluate, measure, and document the academic readiness, learning progress, skill acquisition, or educational needs of students. Hence, it is an essential component of teaching learning process. It assesses teacher effectiveness and learning outcomes both at the same time. Assessment data can be obtained from directly examining student work to assess the achievement of learning outcomes, or can be based on data from which one can make inferences about learning. At the end of every lesson, when a teacher comes out of his class, he usually introspects. What went well? How can I improve upon the lesson? What would I change if I had to teach the lesson again? Whether learning outcomes has been achieved? Reflecting on these questions can help the teacher devise assessment strategies to improve upon his or her own work. In short, reflection helps a teacher to devise assessment tools. Assessment tools devised by teachers on the basis of their reflection can help students in knowing what is important to learn, what they have actually learned, what they have not learned, where and how to improve, what are their stronger areas, what are their weak areas. At the beginning of each lesson, intended learning objectives must be well defined to know how successful you are. And when one's lesson is complete, certain selected learning outcomes should be measured. And if intended learning objectives and learning outcomes perfectly match with each other, indicates you are 100% successful. If there is gap between intended learning objectives and learning outcomes, it means program has to be redesigned to improve learning. Assessment is the process of gathering information about children's learning. Assessment data can be obtained from directly examining student work to assess the achievement of learning outcomes, or can be based on data from which one can make inferences about learning. Purpose of assessment: screening. It helps identifying learners who may require a more comprehensive examination or an early intervention. Learning criteria reference test give information whether learner have mastered specific curriculum contents. Diagnosis tests, formal or informal, are used to review a learner's current level of achievement and progress and to compare with previous records of achievements. Feedback: information from assessment. It is used to develop an individual learning plan. And when once desired learning outcomes have been achieved, child become eligible for certification. According to source book on assessment by NCERT in science subject, assessment should focus on whether the child has learned the following. Observation: has the child observed a phenomenon accurately or superficially? Experimentation: has the learner skillfully planned and performed an experiment or activity? Was the learner able to handle the material and equipment properly? Measurement: was the learner able to take and tabulate the readings accurately? Analysis and interpretation: did the learner use reason for analyzing the results of the experiment and interpret them correctly? Communication: did the learner express the outcome in an organized way? Traditionally, assessment is done through paper pen test or written test. These tests give quantitative scores or achievement levels that may not be reflective of actual learning that has taken place. Such assessment does not help a teacher to reflect upon his or her performance to improve his or her teaching. Alternative tools of assessment do a more systematic assessment of learners' abilities as various methods are used to collect data about learners' achievement and their work is analyzed. Feedback is given so that the learner can take responsibility of his or her own learning. Assessment is integral to the teaching learning process, facilitating student learning and improving instruction, and can take a variety of forms. To create a balanced assessment approach in teaching learning, different types of assessment strategies should be incorporated. Assessment can be of two types: assessment for learning, which is also called formative assessment, and assessment of learning, which is also called summative assessment. Assessment for learning is ongoing assessment that allows teacher to monitor students on a day-to-day basis and modify their teaching based on what the students need to be successful. This assessment provides students with the timely, specific feedback that they need to make adjustments to their learning. Summative assessment or assessment of learning is the snapshot in time that lets the teacher, students, and their parents know how well the student has grasped the learning outcomes of a module or program, and which contributes to the final marks given for the module or lesson. This is very interesting and perfect analogy of formative assessment and summative assessment, that is assessment for learning and assessment of learning. When the chef tastes the soup, this is formative assessment, and when the guest tastes the soup, this is summative assessment. When the chef tastes the soup, sometime he may feel that little extra salt is required in this soup. Then what will he do? He will add some salt. Sometime he may feel that this soup is having little extra salt. Then what will he do? He will just dilute the soup, or he will add some bread chunks in that. Sometimes he may feel that although salt is okay in this soup, but still it is not tasty. Then what will he do? He will add spices, or he will add lemon, and to make it more presentable, he can decorate this soup with the help of coriander. But when the guest tastes the soup, when this soup is served once to the guest, nothing can be done. It means formative assessment always having a scope of improvement and betterment. Let us compare summative assessment, that is assessment of learning, and formative assessment, that is assessment for learning. Purpose of summative assessment is to find out what students know, understand, and can do. It also measures the progress they have made. Purpose of formative assessment is to help students to learn. It is assessment that enhances the learning process. Summative assessment is done after learning is complete, but formative assessment is carried out during the early stages of learning. It is ongoing process. Examples of summative assessment: tests, exams. Examples of formative assessment: questioning, feedback, peer and self-assessment. Controller of summative assessment: teacher and some external body like CBSE. And controller of formative assessment: teacher and student themselves. Summative assessment is backward looking, while formative assessment is forward looking. Summative assessment compare students, but formative assessment measures improvement. Summative assessment present teacher as judge, but formative assessment presents teacher as facilitator. Summative assessment is formal, but formative assessment is informal. Summative assessment is about accountability and formative assessment is about improvement. Formative assessment and summative assessment, both of these are two recognized ways to assess. The goal of formative assessment is to monitor students' learning, to provide ongoing feedback that can be used by instructors to improve their teaching and by students to improve their learning. And the goal of summative assessment is to evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. Both of these are essential for teaching learning process. Assessment practice often engages both at the same time, but what is the difference? Summative assessments are often high stakes while formative assessments are often low stakes. Means summative assessment having high points value and formative assessments usually have low point value. When is one emphasis more appropriate than the other? One has to think. With that, let us conclude this session. And in our next session, we are going to focus exclusively on assessment for learning, that is formative assessment. Thank you. Thank you very much.